Today, I'd like to talk about, more specifically, about the emergence of Orientalist studies in the 19th century, framing it with the contribution of missionaries, in particular between Africa and Spain, or these exchanges that happen facilitated by missionaries between Africa and Spain. But first, I think it would be useful to broadly understand or review the relationship that Spain has had with Islam and the Orient, because I think that will give us a lot of the foundations for its subsequent interest in Orientalist studies in the 19th century. In 711, as we know, a tide of invaders, Muslim invaders, come to Spain and quite successfully conquer almost the entire peninsula. And a few years later, Christians decided to invade from north to south the peninsula. Sometimes that's called the Reconquest of Spain. And this would take a long time until the last Muslim kingdom fell, and that happens in 1492 in the city of Granada. So it is throughout that the Muslim period in Spain that we begin to see periods of humanism in which secular and religious is of particular interest to us today, loci of knowledge form in Spain and produce perhaps the first environments that permit Orientalist studies to occur on the Iberian Peninsula. The first being in the 10th century in Cordoba, which is the caliphate, and it became renowned for the humanistic activities of book production, the recuperation of classical knowledge, translation workshops, and so on and so forth, that scholars were coming from other parts of the world, other parts of Europe, to Cordoba. A similar phenomenon happened in the 13th century in Seville, a Christian kingdom at that time, and again attracting people from other parts of the world to that site of intense scholarly activity. In both of these environments, scholarship was being undertaken in Arabic and in other languages as well. And as we know, Arabic is a key component of Orientalist studies, particularly as we'll see as time moves on. So after 1492, things get a bit interesting in Spain because, in part, influenced by the printing press and other activities happening elsewhere in Europe, a wave of humanism strikes Spain. And we're seeing people scholarship on a scale that had not been enjoyed before, just as was happening elsewhere in Europe. With these readers came an influx of reading material and books, and the need to house them somewhere. So we see the founding of a national library, or what we consider a national library today, called the Escorial, in the latter part of the 16th century. The Escorial had a librarian, Benito Arias Montano. We'll talk about him in a little while, and he was chiefly responsible for gathering the first collection of books, which we'll get to in a moment. Going back to the Muslim population in Spain, with the fall of Granada in 1492, there was still a considerable Muslim population. There was a period of conversion, forced conversion sometimes. And unfortunately, things just didn't work out, and Muslims were expelled from the country between 1609 and 1614. And as a result of that expulsion, characteristics of Islam, such as Arabic, were no longer permitted, had been outlawed, if I can put it that way. At the same time, in the 17th century, I'll add, we're seeing the development of international relations, ambassadorial connections, and so the use of ambassadors. And then, if I could just finish my framing of Spain's connection with the Muslim world, not only are we seeing ambassadors from the Muslim world coming to Spain in the 17th century, but also by the 18th century, scholars from other parts of the world, the Muslim world, the Arab-speaking world, begin to develop an interest in Spain. Their interest in Spain was directly related to that national library I mentioned, because it contained a significant collection of Arabic language books and manuscripts. And so a scholar of particular renown named Miguel de Casiri came to Spain, and he really helped generate interest in these collections that had simply not been read ever by Spaniards, by non-Muslim Spaniards, that is. And so there are two particular technologies of Orientalist studies that developed during this period of between the 16th, really in the 16th century, that become important utensils to missionaries shortly thereafter. And the first of which is language, and and this technology of the dictionary was actually introduced or developed by a missionary in the early 16th century. Pedro de Alcalá was a Geronimite, and as a humanist and missionary, he was a domestic missionary. That is to say, his missions were located in Muslim Spain. So he was working in Granada during the period in which there was large-scale conversion, forced conversion, sometimes. Much of the populations of Granada spoke Arabic. Many did not know Spanish. The problem was the missionaries, they didn't know Arabic, and so how do you convert a population if you're not using a common language? This was one of the tricks. This is one of the issues that the missionaries had to negotiate in this period. So Pedro de Alcalá, as a Geronimite, and as a missionary, was also a humanist, as many religious people were in this period of time, and he was a lexicographer, trained as a lexicographer. So it is no accident that he published his dictionary in Granada, because his dictionary was developed specifically to assist his colleagues in conversion, converting the Muslim population. If you read the dictionary, it contains key phrases that a person who wanted to read a history book written in Arabic would never use. These phrases were only meant to be used for Muslims. Things like one does not wash themselves after praying. It's very specific phrases. But nonetheless, in terms of the theme of this conference, it is during this period that we do begin to see missionaries begin to contribute to, in a humanistic way, to Orientalist studies, although not quite in the same way as they will in the 19th century. The second technology that I'd like to talk about is the library. Because, as I mentioned earlier, in the 16th century, Europeans, and in this case Spain, we began to see a large-scale amassing of manuscripts, but especially books that were prepared in Arabic, because they were being confiscated from those Muslim populations in the south of Spain, because Arabic was considered a sign of Islam. Islam was not permitted, and so materials prepared in Arabic were confiscated and made their way into various collections. An important collection became that of the Escorial. So the first Arabic language book was added in 1567, shortly after the library was built. Montano, the librarian, he managed to amass 1,870 Arabic language manuscripts during his period as a librarian, which is pretty significant. But also these collections, I should have mentioned, Montano himself is also religious. He's not a missionary, but he was the king's confessor for a period of time. Just another interesting connection. But texts were also, Arabic language texts were also coming from other areas. And again, nobody is reading these texts. They are being held almost as a form of trophy or prize that indicated a dominance of Spain over other countries or nations. And so from the Battle of Lepanto, several books came from that battle. But also 16th century humanists like Juan Páez de Castro and Diego Hurtado de Mendoza, they had their personal libraries, and when they died, they bequeathed a number of Arabic language manuscripts to the Escorial Library. So we see the Escorial emerging as a locus of Arabic language manuscripts. In the 17th century, the library of the Moroccan Sultan Mali Zaidan was captured at sea by Luis Fajardo. It's hard to imagine somebody sending their library in a boat, isn't it? But it was captured, and it was brought to Madrid in 1612. Madrid was then where the court was located. And it contained several thousand books, which contained about a myriad of subjects, including history, religion, philosophy, mathematics, medicine, and so on and so forth. Not that anybody read them, but we know that now. As we'll see in a moment, the Sultan was not pleased to lose his library, and he and his descendants pursued it for almost 2 centuries. So it is this large collection of Arabic language books that Khaziri interacted with in the 18th century, but the Spaniards themselves had no idea what sort of richness it included, and so these two technologies of language and libraries seemed to me fundamental in the development of Orientalist studies, and they became important ingredients in the war waged between Spain and Morocco, in particular, in the 17th and 18th centuries. And I guess I'd like to pause here and tell you a bit of a story that embodies not only the history of Spain's contact with the Muslim world, but also foreshadows the emergence of Orientalist studies in Spain. And it comes from a manuscript that came to lie in the hands of some missionaries in the late 18th century. And it involves an ambassador named Mohammed al-Ghazani al-Andalusi, who was sent by that Moroccan Sultan in 1690, so a number of decades later. He was sent to Madrid in order to discuss 2 subjects. The first is the recovery of the Sultan's library. He was very serious about that. The second is was for a prisoner exchange whereby Spanish prisoners who had been captured and were held in Morocco would be exchanged for Muslim prisoners held in Spain. Al-Ghazani himself, interestingly, and if you heard his name, as I said it a moment ago, was a descendant of exiled Spanish Muslims who had left the country following the fall of Granada. So when he prepared a travel log detailing this journey from Ceuta to North Africa. This is what the manuscript looks like. A copy of this travel log, this copy that we have up here on the screen, came to reside in Seville. And there is a second one that is entirely written in Arabic that's located in Madrid. This copy is the only bilingual Spanish-Arabic copy that I have come across. And before elaborating on how missionaries came to be involved in all of this, I promise we'll get there, I'll firstly just tell you a little bit about the travelogue and its importance as well. In this travelogue, the ambassador demonstrates familiarity with Christians because he has interacted with them, both in Morocco with the missionaries that had been sent from Spain, but also with the slaves, the Christian captives that resided in Morocco, and that's in the 17th century. But as this slide demonstrates, he also lacks a familiarity with Christianity, because when he detailed his time in Spain, he would describe how where in each city that he went to, he encountered crowds of people who had gathered around him. And he was convinced that as they were yelling at him, raising their arms out to him, that those Christians, those Spaniards were, he viewed them as ancestors of Muslim Spain who had been conquered, first of all. But he thought that they were reaching out to him for Islam. He thought that they wanted to convert to Islam. We know from other sources that actually they were making fun of him. They were making fun of what he looked like, for wearing the way he was dressed, and because there was a rejection still of all things Islam at the time in Spain. So it's interesting to have those two perspectives on his presence in the country. But also, the travelogue is quite valuable for his experience seeing Spain through the eyes of an exiled Andalusian Muslim. So when he goes through Spain, he views the country as his homeland, his ancestral homeland. So that's quite interesting. And he goes to certain places, like this one in Cordoba, the Caliphal Mosque during the mosque that was built during the Caliphate, resided there. And when he was in the city in 1690, it was under construction as it was converted into a cathedral. So he describes what he saw, and it has architectural value as a description of what the building looked like at the time. It is this desire for knowledge of the Christian world that the Sultan in Morocco desired to acquire, to give him a leg up in the ongoing dispute and war that Spain and Morocco was having. But on the flip side as well, the Spanish monarch Charles II also desired knowledge of Morocco for the same purpose. For some strategic advantage. And this is where we get back to the content of the library and the manuscripts, because Charles II began to believe, or his advisors began to believe, that the contents of the Moroccan Sultan's library might provide Spain with some advantage. And this may well have been true, but nobody was reading the books anyways, which is rather ironic. So the ambassador eventually does reach Madrid just after the first snow in December, and this is where the library is located. Ironically, he was there, did not get to see the library. In fact, they told him that the library had been burned and no longer existed. And in the manuscript, the ambassador describes the king and his funny ways, and because he was a rather interesting king, and he begins to negotiate with him. And Charles II, and here's a portrait of what he looked like. He did agree to some of the ambassador's demands concerning the prisoner exchange, which occurred actually a few months later. But certainly no books returned to the Sultan. And so that's more or less the manuscript. In a larger context, Morocco had been very conscious of the fact that books that used to belong in Morocco had become disseminated throughout Europe. And so it sent Al-Ghazani and a couple other ambassadors to other European nations, England and France in particular, with similar requests and so one of these journeys was actually captured in a painting, quite an arresting painting in my view. In this case, the Moroccan ambassador was in France, and he desired to arrange not only a prisoner exchange, but also the return of a quantity of Arabic language books that still reside today in French collections of the BNF, for example. So the endeavor of guarding these books by European nations and of recuperating them by Moroccans in this case demonstrates a universal appraisal of their value as containers for knowledge. And as we know, knowledge is and remains power. So Spanish authorities began to think about this a little bit different, and we're going to start talking about the missionaries now. And that connects back to those captives held in Morocco, which is one of the other interesting things about the travelogue I just described to you, because thematically it foreshadows the involvement of missionaries. The missionaries that were in Morocco in the 17th century were there chiefly to attend to and advocate for the Christian prisoners and negotiating for their release. So unlike the missionaries in Granada in 1505, missionaries like Alcalá, who did not, well, Alcalá spoke a bit of Arabic, obviously, but the missionaries in that case were not trained in Arabic. They couldn't interact properly with Arabic-speaking people. The missionaries sent to Morocco in the late 17th century did learn Arabic. They had to learn Arabic in order to take care of the prisoners, not to interact with the Christian prisoners themselves who spoke Spanish or some other European language, but rather with the authorities who were in control of the quality of life those Christian prisoners would have. So this was the primary reason they were sent to Africa in the first case in the 17th century. As a result of this protracted role, which continued into the late 18th century, missionaries from both France and Spain began to learn Arabic and Maghrebi, which is a language in North Africa, in order to converse with the local officials. And so essentially Spanish missionaries trained in language and culture over the decades that go into the 18th century in order to successfully accomplish their mission. And they did this without access to language learning tools such as dictionaries. No other dictionary or language manual had been produced to allow for the study of Arabic since the dictionary I showed you earlier, which was intended for missionaries, but for the purpose of conversion, not for the purpose of conversing with Arab-speaking authorities who you're not going to get very far with if you're only going to try and convert them. So now you see why the story about the ambassador is of so much interest to us. Returning to the subject of the conference, the role of the missionaries in developing scholarship, in our case, the discipline of Orientalist studies, I will return to how this manuscript containing the travelogue came to my attention, because the documents such as this one reveals some of the complexities of this topic. This copy of the travelogue now resides at the University of Seville after becoming incorporated into its collections in the mid-19th century as part of a collection owned by Brother Pedro Martín del Rosario. More on him and his colleagues in a moment. The document itself is bilingual. That is clearly, there is a section in Arabic. The entire document is in Arabic, and then the entire document in the second half of the book is in Spanish. And the Spanish copy, interestingly, contains some Arabic parts to it, where the prayers are located. So clearly somebody has copied it in Arabic from an original source and then translated it into Spanish. Al-Ghazani's narrative was certainly prepared after he returned to Morocco, sometime before he died in 1720. We know that it enjoyed some limited circulation as a copied and not published manuscript in Morocco, as a book in Morocco. So, because we've never found the book outside of Morocco, except in Europe, but not before the period in which this manuscript appears in the 19th century, the source of the travelogue must be Morocco. And it seems likely that somebody copied the manuscript in Morocco and returned to Spain with it. The hand is clearly a more modern one, likely from the late 18th century or 19th century. Precisely who did this is not known, but the group to which that person belongs can be traced. Aside from the administrative authorities in Spain and France as well, the only other critical body of Spaniards who were not held captive in Morocco were missionaries. So indeed, in the 1780s, the monarchy increased its funding for missionaries to go to Morocco. Brother Martin del Rosario, who I mentioned before, and who possessed the manuscript of the Moroccan ambassador's travels, at some point he possessed it anyhow. He was he belonged to the province of the Descalce Franciscans of San Diego de Andalusia. It's a very long name, and their this order, their chief work or dedication involved recovering Christian slaves in Morocco. So that's what they did. That's all they did. With increased funds from the monarchy, therefore, language training schools were set up in Spain for the first time. For the first time since Muslim Spain had found its conclusion in 1492, Arabic was being taught in Spain. And Brother Martin and his colleagues learned Arabic prior to leaving for Morocco, which is a big change. The previous century, missionaries learned Arabic in Morocco, but now they're learning Arabic in Spain. So while in Morocco, therefore, they were already able to converse and they were able to continue their language acquisition while also learning about the history, about non-Spanish history and philosophy and literature. The monarchy saw great value in these activities for the purpose of obtaining a strategic advantage by understanding the contents of Arab language manuscripts. Housed within the collections of the Escorial, because it had become aware, thanks to a little bit of scholarship happening in the 18th century about these collections, and began to believe that they may contain significant findings of use to Spain. Spanish authorities also asked missionaries to bring back more texts for the purpose of obtaining even more of this knowledge. And so the missionaries' second job quickly became one of translation. As a result of this critical mass of missionaries learning Arabic and serving as teachers of the language and then as translators, a significant quantity of texts written in Arabic like this one were suddenly available to scholars for study. And so more importantly, the missionaries began to share their knowledge their language learning resources and developed tools such as new dictionaries that were designed for scholars or people who wanted to learn the language and that were not confined to missionary work for the purpose of conversion. And so this allowed scholars to further delve into collections of Arabic books. Brother Martin's colleague, Manuel Bacas Merino, published the first Spanish-Arabic dictionary, as you can see on the screen at the moment, to appear since Alcalás. So this is in 1807, almost 3 centuries after the last dictionary, Spanish-Arabic dictionary or language manual, had appeared in Spain. And this was followed by French-Arabic ones, and so on and so forth. It is due to the missionaries' development of linguistic tools in the 19th century that scholars such as Pascual de Gallangos was able to make significant discoveries in the collections housed at the Escorial that have since transformed our conception of Spanish history and literature. For example, he and his colleagues encountered Spanish poetry written in Arabic, in the Arabic alphabet called harchas or carchas. He also uncovered Spanish historical and literary texts written in Arabic alphabet called al-Jamiado. And so the interest in this collection overall has had additional implications. Along with the installment of French authority in Spain in the early 19th century, during the Bonaparte years, came increasing scholarly interest in Spanish history on the part of French scholars who brought with them Enlightenment era methods, which just weren't being used in Spain at that point. These methods then mixed with German philological trends and yielded an international fascination with Spanish history and literature that had at its epicenter Europe's curiosity for anything Oriental during the time. So Spain, as Europe's Oriental corner, furthermore became entrenched in the foreign imagination by writers such as Byron and Hemingway. In conclusion, the impacts of the missionaries' activities were particularly or principally concerned with attending to Spanish prisoners in Morocco, and these radiate significantly into other areas of concern, as we've seen, which range from the emergence of Arabic as a second language and the ability to study and learn it in Spain, the development of Orientalist studies and scholarship entirely devoted to this discipline being conducted by Spaniards as well as by missionaries in the 19th century, the discovery of new forms of literature and new historical sources, which in turn have shaped the Spanish literary canon in very important ways. It is also interesting to note the differences in these three humanistic environments facilitated by missionaries and that contributed to the development of Orientalist studies. So in the 16th century, domestic missions engineered language resources for the purpose of improving the conditions of spiritual conversion to Christianity. In the 17th century, missionaries began to learn Arabic as a necessary means of communicating with officials in an effort to take care of Christian slaves, but they had no resources or scholarly support for the undertaking. And by the late 18th century, however, we see the development of language learning resources and language schools for missionaries as part of the state-sponsored program of knowledge production and acquisition. These resources became widely disseminated in the 19th century and made available to secular and increasingly international audiences. That's it. Thank you.